Good morning. Welcome to Beck's Lutheran Church in the Maskless sermon for the third Sunday in Easter 2021. Our reading comes from the Gospel of Luke, the 24th chapter. As they, the disciples, were saying this, the Easter confession that he is risen, Jesus himself stood among them. But they were startled and frightened and supposed that they saw a spirit. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do questions rise in your hearts? See my hands and my feet, that it is I myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit has not flesh and bones as you see that I have." And while they still disbelieved for joy and wondered, he said to them, "Have you anything here to eat?" They gave him a piece of broiled fish, and he took it and ate it before them. The Gospel of the Lord. It was in the middle of a very dark night, while a group of students and their pastor lay sleeping on the dock on the edge of Lake Marion in South Carolina, that the voice came. Every person in that group was jolted out of a sound sleep by a deep voice. "Michael, it's time to come home." The pastor later reported that he just lay there at first, hoping that the voice didn't call his name next. He wasn't ready to go home yet. Of course, the voice belonged to just the father of one of the students. But in that moment, in the still quiet on the shore of a lake, it had seemed for just a moment like it was someone else calling. And it's interesting that the reaction was one of fear, if only for a moment. If God were to suddenly appear to you sometime when you least expect it, how do you think you would react? It'd be interesting to do a poll on this subject, see the spectrum of where people fall in their predicted reactions. Some few would be happy and welcoming. Some would be suspicious and doubtful. But most, like the group on the dock by Lake Marion, I imagine would be downright terrified. I guess the question is, how do you think of God? When you envision God, what is it that you see? If you envision God with a face, what kind of expression does it bear? Do the eyes twinkle or do they burn? Do the corners of the mouth curl upward or downward? Well, probably it depends on what you're thinking or feeling at the moment, but you may also have a more general impression of what God is like overall and how God faces us, the beings of creation. Are you afraid of God? Not fear in the sense of respect, as we might have learned in Sunday school or confirmation that we're to fear God, but fear in the sense that you are worried God might do something to harm you, to trick you, or to condemn you, or to come some dark night to call you home before you're ready to go. To judge by the picture of God I get from listening to many Christians, from reading their tracts, from hearing their preaching on TV or the radio, many people think of God as a stern and perhaps vindictive judge. Much of what I hear and read from these people is simply full of threats of death and hell, punishments for wrong thinking and wrongdoing. Sometimes I think these people see God as some kind of psychopathic and violent being just looking for an excuse to just condemn all of us. Well, no wonder people would jump at if God just suddenly appeared. God's watching over us suddenly becomes not a positive, not a gift, not a consolation, but a danger. And God's appearance to us is then not full of grace, hope, and love, but of terror and mortality, hopelessness and powerlessness. In my time, I've been startled by how many lifelong Lutherans have never managed to welcome and buy into the doctrine of grace being a free gift from God, unearned, undeserved, impossible to earn or deserve, given only because of God's overly abundant and compassionate love for us. How many Lutherans have I talked to who secretly wonder in the depths of their heart, have I been good enough? Have I earned God's salvation? Have I done enough to deserve this? But we're not alone in being afraid of the things of God. They were startled and terrified, it says, of the disciples in our gospel reading. Jesus' appearance to the disciples spooked them. And perhaps we can say no wonder. They were afraid and remained afraid until Jesus had sufficiently proven to them that he was who he seemed to be. Even then, it doesn't let up entirely. And that he offered them not judgment and punishment, but hope and peace. They miss the words that are so commonly on Jesus' lips, peace be with you. And instead, he wonders why they're so absolutely mortally terrified. We often miss what God is saying to us, hearing instead what we expect to hear. Perhaps Jesus says, peace be with you, and we jump out of our skins. Or God says, I love you. We cower in fear. Jesus said to the disciples after they were finally settled down enough to listen, that he had come to fulfill what the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms all said about the Messiah. But what is it that we hear when we read the Hebrew Scriptures? What most of us probably refer to as the Old Testament. Oh yeah, we hear all the nice things in Isaiah, like the one about a young woman conceiving and bearing a child. But usually when we think of the Hebrew Scriptures, we hear a lot of gloom and doom about how if we don't straighten out and fly right, we're going to get some serious punishment. But that's not the only message there is. That's not the only thing that Jesus fulfills. For example, whereas we see the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah and what we imagine is their eternal condemnation, what we find in the prophet Ezekiel is that he tells us something different and new, speaking with the voice of God and the authority of God. Ezekiel 16:53 says, I, God, I shall restore their fortunes, the fortunes of Sodom and the fortunes of Samaria, and I will restore your own fortunes along with theirs. As for your sisters, Sodom will return to her former state. Samaria will return to her former state, and you shall return to your former state. Does this go along with your picture of what God has done and promises to do? Because this doesn't show us a hateful or vengeful God, but a merciful and forgiving God. Jesus incarnates and fulfills what Ezekiel wrote in welcoming to himself all of us sinners and forgiving us and understanding us, in restoring us to the state that God intended for us, God's beloved children. Whereas we see the beauty of our worship and our offerings to God, the beauty of living by the rules that we think of as set by God for us, we find another prophet, Amos, crying out against these things. Amos writes, I despise your festivals, and I take no delight in your solemn assemblies. Even though you offer me your burnt offerings and grain offerings, I will not accept them. and the offerings of well-being of your fatted animals I will not look upon. Take away from me the noise of your songs. I won't listen to the melody of your harps. But let justice roll down like the waters, and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. Now, while the tone of that passage in the book of Amos is one of anger, it's not the judgmental kind that we so dread, but rather is a concern by God for the plight of the less fortunate people. It's God crying for us to make real the things we believe and live them as if they matter. Jesus incarnates and fulfills what Amos wrote in welcoming to him the people who stood outside of the accepted and upright religious community, while often rejecting those who were so adept at offering song, sacrifice, and worship, all while people wept on their doorsteps. We expect God to love only the faithful and ultimately to reject the unfaithful. But the prophet Hosea shows us a picture of a God who loves even the unfaithful, using the illustration of the prophet Hosea remaining faithful to his faithless wife. The Lord said to me again, "Go, love a woman who has a lover and is an adulteress, just as the Lord loves the people of Israel, though they turn to other gods." This is not ultimately a God of judgment, of abandonment, but a God of ultimate faithfulness, of enduring love. Jesus incarnates and fulfills what Amos wrote in welcoming the people who have turned away so often from the God of Israel. Perhaps this sentiment was well expressed by a Catholic priest named Joseph Girzon in his novel entitled Joshua in the Holy Land. The character of Joshua, who is meant to be Jesus returning incognito, says, "I know they don't believe in God, but their lack of faith is not in God as he is, but in God as others have conceived him and presented him to them. This God they reject. They're still searching. You do them a service by presenting to them a Jesus who is reasonable and caring, and a God who is gentle and caring. They need to know they are loved." You find this vision of a loving and forgiving and welcoming God throughout the entirety of the Hebrew Scriptures. From the Torah, the first 5 books, to the prophets, to the Psalms and other writings. These are the writings that Jesus fulfilled then and continues to fulfill today. So if you ever feel the presence of God come and stand among you, there's no need to be afraid. For your God always comes to you with a greeting of peace. Your God always comes to console you and offer you hope. That's why Jesus shows his hands and his feet to the disciples here. Yes, indeed, it seems that Luke says that these hands and feet, demonstrating that Jesus is flesh and blood rather than something ghostly, are proof of the identity of Jesus. But they're also an offer of another kind. For where the Lord's physical hands and feet are no longer present, the work of countless people in simple and sincere ministries continues to bear witness to Jesus' living presence. Although he may not appear in our midst and eat broiled fish, his presence is tangible in soup kitchens, around the kitchen table, and around the altar table. As in that room with the 11 disciples, so now, the most convincing proof of the resurrection and of God's grace-filled compassion for us all is the daily testimony of the faithful that Christ still lives, and the work of his hands and feet continues in and amongst us. This is the God that the Scriptures bear witness to. This is the God that Jesus showed us in his entire incarnation. We, through Jesus and through the Scriptures, and even through one another, have seen this God of love and forgiveness, of compassion so great that even Sodom and Hosea's faithless wife still have hope and a glorious promised future. And this witness of love in the past and a promise of greater love yet to come gives us the strength to live out that love today. It gives us the courage to welcome those whom Jesus welcomed, to love those whom Jesus loved. It gives us the fortitude and the confidence to offer hope and forgiveness even to Sodom, to the unfaithful, and even, yes, to ourselves. One of Luke's concerns in writing this gospel was to show God's care for the poor, the oppressed, and the abused. And this is what we have seen. These are the Scriptures that we have seen Jesus fulfill before our eyes and in our hearts. Jesus' hands and feet may not appear in the world in the same way. Jesus now uses our hands and our feet to go and carry on his ministry, his love, his compassion. You are witnesses of these things. Amen.